let me just say, first of all, it drives people like me absolutely nuts. You know, it used to be you build your campaign from election day back. You knew how much money you had to spend the last 3 or 4 weeks of a campaign to communicate. Where today, you know, people an event may take place in the last 30 or 60 days, and a third of your electorate's already voted and has no impact whatsoever. So you really have to run a far more sustained campaign. You can't peak it like you used to be able to. The number of voters who make up their mind in the closing days is diminishing all the time. And so what you really have to do is you have to kind of keep reinforcing that base, expand a little bit, but keep reinforcing it so that, and you can monitor, I mean, exactly when someone gets a ballot, you can monitor pretty much whether they voted. It has not eliminated any of the needs for the other things, the people needs, I mean, I think you now have a 60, 70, 90-day voting period where before you had 1 day and you could basically build everything for that one day. And it's, as I said, it drives someone like me nuts that, you know, I've never been outbought in the last month of a campaign. It's totally irrelevant now. And I think to a certain extent what that has done in some of these cases has convinced people that they need to spend more because they don't think they've reached everybody. And I think some of these people with unlimited budgets, I think an unlimited budget can be detrimental, and I basically think you've got to figure out what a campaign's going to cost. I hope you raise that amount of money and stay very disciplined in your spending. And when you get to a point where you know you've got a rich candidate who will spend anything, you've got to be somewhat careful in the sense that you may be cluttering your message, or basically you lose that discipline. Yeah.
Mark, we could probably do an entire hour on the impact of technology on your line of work, and landlines versus cell phones, and internet polls, and automated dialing, and robocalls, and all this sort of stuff. What is your, as somebody who's, I guess, well, Mark had sort of an academic background. He taught at Yale. He and Ed Lazarus went into business in 1981, I believe it was. So you've been doing this for a while, and you've seen pre-internet, post-internet. But can you just talk a little bit about sort of the same sorts of things we're talking about here?
Sure. Well, we could do 2 hours on it. It'd be very boring 2 hours. Look, the reality is polling has gotten much harder, and I think any of the pollsters in the audience would agree with that. It's gotten much harder in part because people are much less willing to answer their phones, in part because people have the technology not to answer their phones. People screen their calls. It's harder because people have cell phones and don't even pay attention to their landlines, or now increasingly don't have landlines at all. And so unless you have a means and mechanism to take into account excuse me, those changes, you're not going to have an accurate poll. And with all the bells and whistles that we do with polling, at the end of the day, if it's not accurate, if the poll's not accurate, it's really not worth very much. And so that accuracy has to be the bedrock of what we're doing. We found in any number of states this year that if you were not, for example, including cell phones in your sample, if you were not, for example, making repeated efforts to get in touch with people, if you didn't have defined the right electorate, you were going to miss the ball and miss it absolutely completely. You know, Nevada is probably the preeminent example of this, but you know, of all the polling that was done in Nevada, ours, fortunately, was the only polling that showed Harry Reid ahead. Every other poll did not, and you could look at those polls and you could refigure those polls looking at various things. Did they have the right model in terms of likely voters? Did they have cell phones or not? And you could see the difference. When we split our sample and looked at people who got on cell phones versus people we got on landlines, there was a big difference. The people we got on landlines looked pretty much like the public polls. The people we got on cell phones looked very, very different from those folks. And people who have cell phones do vote. And the same thing was true in any number of states. And we had, you know, in California, we were doing Senator Boxer's campaign. There were polls coming out showing Senator Boxer running even with Carly Fiorina. And we were even among people that we reached on landlines. Finally talked one of the pollsters into including a cell phone component on his, which they're not allowed to do. I mean, legally, they're not allowed to use their technology to call cell phones. Finally talked him into doing it, and they showed, yes, the number that we would have normally put out was even, and if we included the cell phones, it would be +7. Well, it wasn't quite right because it was +10, which is what we had. But nonetheless, it gets a lot closer. So the evidence is absolutely unequivocally clear. Unless you're reaching those people through that use different technologies, you're not going to have accurate samples. Now, is that true everywhere? No. There are places where we looked where there was no difference between people we got on cell phones and people we got on landlines. But you have no way of knowing that unless
you-
you actually
until you
get
contact
on the cell phones and check.
So looking down the road, nobody knows where we're going with our communications and technology. Where do you see things in 5 years? How much harder or more expensive is it going to be to get quality data?
It's going to be much harder and much more expensive, and that's why I hope to be retired in a fairly short order.
You don't
No,
think
seriously, I think, you know, there's going to come a point where it's extraordinarily hard to do what we do. And are there going to be substitute methods? I think there will be. But I think in the long term, what the kind of work we do is going to really migrate very much from sort of what we would call point estimates, from figuring out who's ahead, who's behind, and by how much, to really focused almost exclusively on message testing, because we're going to have to essentially throw up our arms and say, we're not sure if we're ahead by 3 or behind by 2.
will you ever get to the point of actually going door to door and asking people questions?
Well, that's what we used to do.
I know that.
Back in the day. And that too has all kinds of problems associated with it and tremendous expense.
Questions? Yes, sir.
Excuse me.
Yeah, Steve's question is about the future of 527s and C4s.
Well, I think right now the future is unbounded money, as long as there are people willing to invest in it. The nature of the structure may change, and that the 527 regulations may change or go out, and the C4 may change or be adapted or simply eliminated. But what is clear from the Citizens United case in the current court, apparently, is that money is an essential ingredient of our First Amendment rights. And so I think if there's anything likely to be in the near term, I mean, I hate saying this, having fought for almost 40 years for campaign finance reform, but it's been like pissing up a rope. I mean, it just hasn't worked, and so now we're faced with huge amounts of money, but generally some of the time from limited numbers of donors, but sometimes from massive numbers of donors like Obama. And I think the legal restrictions on it are not going to be much, except for disclosure, which becomes I think very important, and the ability to disclose instantly and accurately the source of funds may make a difference.
It's a two-edged sword. First, it's great fun to run a campaign without a candidate. And a candidate's wife.
Right, especially.
Or husband.
Right.
The other side of it is going back to the importance of the clarity of message. Your message can get really mixed up in these races. You have your candidate, you have your campaign, you want to run a certain element of messaging, and all of a sudden, everyone assumes that these independent expenditures and what have you are all part of your drill. Mike Huckabee was a perfect example. You know, anybody that knew Mike Huckabee knew that he was pro-life. We didn't want to make that the focus of our campaign. There was a group that got in with a very, very strident, anti-abortion messaging, and people would tell us, we don't like those commercials. Those commercials turn us off. They weren't our commercials. There was nothing we could do about it. And I think to a certain extent, that's part of the danger of it, is that you can't coordinate, and I think it blurs the messaging, and I think that's the downside. The good side is there's these campaigns, and I don't think we would have won a Republican majority if we didn't have, especially in the House, if we didn't have these kinds of organizations that were out there basically putting sufficient resources in there. It used to be you could take 30 races a year, both sides, and target them and have sufficient resources. Today you can take unlimited. I think that's why we won assembly races, state house races, all the rest of it. It's given us a great resource to balance it off, and I think it's part of what's going on in the labor battles in Wisconsin and elsewhere too. It's because the other side obviously can use it very effectively too.
Look, we were in, in any number, as Democrats, in any number of situations where we have candidates that work their hearts out for 2 years, for 4 years, for 6 years, raising money, and day in, day out, nose to the grindstone, terrible work from their point of view, really hard, a lot of time invested, and overnight, they're equalized by some outside group coming in. That's enormously frustrating to a candidate, I can tell you from listening to many of them shout about it. And that did happen in any number of cases around the country. I mean, Crossroads, you have to give them tremendous credit. They raised a tremendous amount of money, and they brought it to bear in a significant number of races, and either evened up a situation that would have been dramatically uneven, or in fact ended up outspending, combined with the candidates, ended up outspending us in state after state, in district after district across the country. Well, the problem is, of course, no one's going to sit still and let that happen again, so we're going to end up doing the same thing on our side this time. So you're going to have an explosion, an absolute explosion of this outside money, most of it unregulated, much of it undisclosed, and in my mind, this is not free speech. Money is not speech. Money's a megaphone. You don't have a constitutional right to a megaphone. You don't have a constitutional right to have a newspaper of your own. The reality, you can have one if you want one, but the reality is the megaphone is going to get huge here on both sides, tremendous amounts of money over which candidates have no control, and as Ed rightly pointed out, candidates are going to lose control of their message to a very substantial extent, or at least have that risk.
Right, now, which gives an advantage to the NRAs and other brand. It's what the commercial world calls brand equity or brand awareness. The people who are able to control their brand, which a candidate can't. If there's a lot of independent expenditures, that's not possible. But the cause organizations will have some advantage there.
Well, you know, Roger and I have been on opposite sides of this whole financing question for decades, and we can say whatever we want, and it's also true that campaign managers have never liked independent efforts because they can't control it. But democracy is a sort of unruly beast, and with all the money on both sides, and there's never been in really contested races a great disparity of money because contributors are activists and they contribute, some in big dollars, some in small dollars, but in today's world it comes up. Now the key point, when all else is said, goes back to something that Ed said. We used to be able to have 30 or 40 contested races where everybody could get the money. That day has passed. And in fact, one can make an argument, and I would, that what we have today, because of this availability of resources and technology and the ability to raise it, is we've expanded, in terms of the democracy, not in terms of the party, we have expanded the playing field so that incumbents are not as comfortable and can't be as comfortable as they could have been 10 or 15 years ago. And if you're looking at it from the standpoint of the system, is that a good or a bad thing? I think it's a pretty good thing.
I wanted to give each of you a chance to sort of expound on a sort of a free-form question, looking back at your experience and your own personal history, and we've been touching on a lot of these things this morning. But the consultant's role, the political consultant's role, has obviously changed for all of the reasons that we've touched on. But I guess maybe we'll start with Ed and work back this way. Thinking about one of the jobs that you had as White House political director, I guess your most recent descendant today would be David Plouffe, who's sitting in the West Wing. I think you were in the EOB